We are just about 3 weeks away from actual football, talking ACC style with Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC and also Fighting Gobbler. Please join him there. And of course, Mark Rogers TV with a complete look at college football. Subscribe to my YouTube channel and also catch the audio versions of full conversations with contributors like Mike at iTunes, Podbean, and Stitcher. Just search Mark Rogers TV. All right, Mike, top 5 backs in the ACC. Kind of a difficult task. Have to do a little digging here with the likes of Dalvin Cook, Elijah Hood, Wayne Gallman moving on, as well as James Conner.
Yeah, so all those running backs you just mentioned were top 5 running backs in the conference last year, and they all declared early and left school because they were so talented, and they all got selected in the NFL draft, and they're already beginning their professional careers. So now we're running out of running backs, believe it or not, that have much experience at all throughout the ACC. It's now a much thinner crop of talent as far as running backs are concerned throughout the conference. So ranking a top 5 has kind of been an arduous task here, but when considering an honorable mention fringe top 5 guy, I'm going to name a 6th here for the sake of doing so. John Hillman at Boston College, 2014 season. He, as a true freshman, ran for 860 yards and 13 touchdowns. Was one of the better running backs in the conference that year, and he was only a freshman. We've yet to see him return to form since that year, because as a sophomore in 2015, he got hurt in the 2nd or 3rd game of the year, only 198 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns. Ended up taking a medical redshirt that year, and then last year he was not nearly as effective. Now, obviously, the offensive line at Boston College is not as good as it was for him in 2014. It's a tough offense to run in right now. Only averaged 2.9 yards per carry last year. So John Hillman, the talent's there. He's just yet to return to form. So it'll be interesting to see if Boston College can kind of right the ship there in their running game this year. They're definitely going to need it, especially with potential inexperience or ineffectiveness at the quarterback position that we've gotten so used to with the Eagles over the last couple of seasons. The number 5 running back in the conference for me is Trayvon McMillan from Virginia Tech. Ran for 1,000 yards as a freshman in 2015, had 7 touchdowns, also had a receiving touchdown that season. Really came on in mid-October, so I think that could have been a potential 1,400 or 1,500 yard season. The one thing to note about Trayvon McMillan is that his best year came in an offense that was led by Scott Loeffler, the current offensive coordinator of Boston College, when he was the offensive coordinator at Tech in the last season under Frank Beamer. Trayvon McMillan last year only had 671 yards on the ground and 7 touchdowns. He had 3 touchdowns receiving. The issue with McMillan is he lost a few fumbles and fell out of favor with the coaching staff. And he's not a great fit in this offense. He's more of an I formation running back. And now you have a system there in Blacksburg where, Justin Fuente likes to throw the ball a ton and use more jet sweep action. And that's not really Trayvon McMillan's game. McMillan's greatest success was his freshman year when Virginia Tech technically ran a spread offense in the last year under Frank Beamer. But they did run out of a lot of single back and I formation sets as well to mix in, and that's where Trayvon McMillan thrives. So talent's there for McMillan. I'm just not sure the offense is going to be there, but he's a number 5 running back because he did eclipse 1,000 yards in his freshman year, and the talent is definitely there. Number 4 running back for me is Dietrich Mills of Georgia Tech, true freshman last year, 771 yards and 12 touchdowns. Obviously, for running backs, that's an awesome offense to be in because they do run that option. And, Dietrich Mills is going to be, the number 1 option in that running game for Georgia Tech heading into this season. He was so strong last year. I expect him to take the next step forward this year and definitely be on track to rush for 1,000 yards as long as he stays healthy. He missed 4 games last year, didn't end up playing. I think if he plays in all 12 games this year, plus a bowl game, I think he could easily eclipse the 1,000-yard mark. And in that offense, 1,500 yards for Dietrich Mills is definitely not out of the question. Number 3 for me is Cam Akers of Florida State. He's going to be a true freshman. I think I'm going to get a decent amount of flack for putting him as high as I am, but he was one of the best recruits ever coming out of the state of Mississippi. Was the top running back on the board last year. Coming out of high school. And so he's going to be starting as a true freshman at Florida State because Dalvin Cook moved on to the NFL. Florida State does have Jacques Patrick. He could see some playing time there at running back, but I do expect Cam Akers by at least late September, early October, if he's not already, to be receiving the bulk of the carries in that offense. Akers, coming out of the state of Mississippi, 8,100 yards rushing, 78 touchdowns, 5,000 yards passing, and 71 touchdowns for his career. So he played a lot of quarterback in high school. Obviously, piled up the stats and is an absolute freak athlete if you've seen him on film. Guy can't be stopped, and that's a dangerous running back there for Florida State moving forward. Rest of the ACC will be put on notice by Cam Akers sooner rather than later, and I think he's going to get a ton of looks in that offense as a true freshman. Number 2 on my list is Quadri Allison of Pittsburgh, and Allison's another one of those guys that thrived a couple of years ago. In 2015, when James Conner underwent the knee procedure and then was undergoing treatment for cancer, Allison, who was a relative unknown as a true freshman, became the lead back in that offense. He rushed for 1,100 yards and 11 touchdowns that year, was averaging 5.3 yards per carry. Last year as a sophomore, took the back seat, only had 127 yards last season, but he took the back seat to James Conner, who returned. And, as you all saw last year with James Conner, he returned to form pretty quickly, which was a surprise to many. James Conner was a 2,000-yard running back, a few years ago before the cancer treatment. I think he ended up rushing for 1,800 yards and, was just short of that 2,000-yard mark, and everybody believed that he did have that talent. And when James Conner came back with a vengeance last year, Quadri Allison took the back seat as a sophomore. He's going to be the starting running back again for Pittsburgh and receive the bulk of the carries, and I think he can return to form like he was in 2015 when he was a true freshman. Allison definitely has a bunch of talent there. He's a bigger back, 6'2", 230, really tough to bring down, and has good breakaway speed as well. And the number 1 running back for me, and really for the number 1 running back in this conference, it's not even really close. He's in a tier of his own, and that's Mark Walton. Mark Walton's entering his junior year now. He had 1,100 yards and 14 touchdowns last year, 240 yards receiving and a touchdown as well. Averaged 5.3 yards per carry. He's in the perfect offense there at Miami. It fits his style of play. He's an absolute burner. They run him out of single back sets. He's good out of shotgun as well. Guy's an absolute speedster, can make people miss in the open field. He's just got it all. Extremely dynamic player. I think a guy like Cam Akers at Florida State could approach the level of Mark Walton in the coming seasons. And I know, Hurricanes fans aren't going to like that. I just compared Mark Walton to a Florida State back that's up and coming. But I think those are the 2 types of talents we have there at the running back position. But Mark Walton, as far as I'm concerned, at least entering the 2017 season, because we haven't seen a lot of these other running backs in extended time, or we haven't seen the success in the last couple of years out of these guys, Mark Walton's really in a league of his own, just coming off of the season that he had last year and the ability of that Miami offense, which should be very good heading into 2017. So that's my top 5 list, plus an honorable mention with John Hillman. Again, pretty weak conference overall as far as running backs are concerned. When you compare it to last year when there were guys like Elijah Hood at the running back position, you had James Conner at the running back position, Wayne Gallman. All these guys are gone now and have moved on, so it'll be interesting to see how the running back position ends up panning out with a lot of new faces mixed in with old as well heading into 2017.
Mike, you finish off with Mark Walton at number 1. He impressed me as a freshman, gaining 1,000 yards and finishing up in the bowl game against Washington State in particular is something that you mentioned about his ability out of the backfield to catch passes. You mentioned the receiving yards, also caught 27 passes, and it's beyond the numbers. If you watch the Canes play and watch his ability to run routes, he's really a more developed player as a receiver out of the backfield than most running backs that you'll see, and has great hands, has made us several one-handed catches. And as we look at this conference, Miami might be the one team that kind of bridges the gap between, at this point, Florida State and Clemson and the rest of the conference. And they are the one hope for the rest of the ACC to break through and challenge that 2-headed monster. And Mark Walton might be the most important player on the Miami roster. We know he's going to be productive, but because of the issues that the Canes have had up front along the offensive line, not just protecting Brad Kaya, but also opening up running lanes, his statistics could be even better if they have made the improvements that many people have believe that Miami has along the front. He's also ultra important as well because of the thin situation at running back for Miami. They are paper thin at running back, and they need Mark Walton to stay healthy. So Mark Richt is going to have to make some decisions regarding Mark Walton being a workhorse and also keeping him healthy for the long haul. So he's healthy and ready and rolling down the stretch as Miami tries to win a Coastal Division for the first time. There's a couple running backs on that Canes roster also to keep a lookout for. Travis Homer, who was the number 11 rated running back coming out of the 2016 class, only carried it 7 times. Probably going to see a lot more this fall in relief of Walton. And also Robert Burns, number 28 running back out of Gulliver Prep in Miami this past recruiting class. So between Burns and Homer, they're 2 talented backs. They may need to spell Walton more often than has been the situation in the past. You talk about the Florida State running back situation with Cam Akers. You are going to catch a little flack, and I will as well, because a player who has yet to step on the field has proven nothing. Yes, but all you have to do is look at every position across college football, and each season we have more than a handful of top freshmen that come in and prove themselves. So it's just a projection that the talent that Cam Akers has shown the college scouts is going to come through in season number 1. What's amazing, Mike, as you well know about Florida State recruiting, is it's just not Cam Akers. They have 4 running backs currently on the roster and probably another 3 that are a little bit deeper in the recruiting rankings, but 4 that ranked in the top 7 at running back in their recruited classes. So Cam Akers this year at number 1, also Kalan Laybourne at number 4. So they recruited and signed 2 of the top 4 running backs in the 2017 class. Last year, it was Amir Rasul who could break into the lineup and gain some valuable playing time. He was the 7th rated running back, according to 247 Sports in 2016. Then if you go back to 2015, it was Jaquez Patrick, who is the number 3 rated running back coming out of high school. Just the abundance of riches there in Tallahassee. You mentioned Kadre Allison. I believe it was just 1 carry for James Conner against Youngstown State in the opener 2 years ago, and then he was instantly knocked out, and Kadre Allison became a star, rushing for the numbers that you outlined. But in addition, it was pretty impressive who he gained yardage against. He had 100-yard games against the likes of Virginia Tech, 122. He had 3 other ACC games in which he gained over 100 yards rushing. So he did it against meaningful opponents for a Pitt team that moved on to postseason play. So Allison gets back into the mix as the number 1 back this year. A.J. Davis, number 22 running back in high school football last year, the top prospect at running back for the Pitt Panthers this year. C.J. Fuller at Clemson touched it quite a bit, 211 yards last year. Tavian Feaster, a guy that we've talked about in our recruiting segments, ready to step in for Wayne Gallman as well, was rated the number 1 all-purpose back in high school football in the 2016 class. Last year, 221 yards for the Clemson Tigers and 2 touchdowns. You mentioned the Georgia Tech situation. They're always going to run it and run it effectively, so somebody's going to gain all those rushing yards. And as you mentioned, Dedrick Mills would be the number 1 prospect to do that. He had a huge game in the bowl game against Kentucky with a $169 and a touchdown. Also, despite losing 2 of their top 4 rushing leaders from last year, Clinton Litch could also be a pretty valuable back for Georgia Tech this year, after gaining a tidy 11 yards per carry in 37 attempts last year against some lesser opponents. So interesting year for running backs, a lot of unknown commodities across the ACC after that bevy of stars moved on to the NFL from 2016. We are running down the top 5 wide receivers in the ACC heading into 2017 with the season opener just less than 3 weeks away. We bring in Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC and also Fighting Gobbler to help us sort out a list of wide receivers that don't include the pair from North Carolina last year, the pair from Virginia Tech, of course, the 2 from Clemson, a lot of top wide receivers from 2016 gone on to the NFL. So what do we have left, Mike?
Yeah, so it's a conference that is also thin at the wide receiver position. We talked about the running backs being a bit thin. Quarterbacks in the Coastal Division being a bit thin, so a lot of turnover, especially on the offenses in this conference. But yeah, the top 5 receivers for me, and it's kind of 5 and 5A here, so I'm cheating a little bit, naming 6 receivers total. But these guys play the same sort of game. Quadri Henderson, the wide receiver from Pittsburgh. He had 286 yards receiving, 1 touchdown last year. He had 631 yards rushing. It was averaging 10.5 yards per carry and 5 touchdowns. He's the human Swiss Army knife for the Pittsburgh offense. It'll be interesting to see if he has the same effect now that Matt Canada, the offensive coordinator, has moved on. The other guy for me is Jalen Samuels. They're occupying the number 5 spot as well because he's a very similar type receiver for NC State. The Quadri Henderson is for Pittsburgh. Jalen Samuels last year, 565 yards, 7 touchdowns. Running the football, had 189 yards and 6 touchdowns. Listed as a wide receiver / tight end. He's a versatile receiver to me. Does a little bit of everything for that offense, much like Henderson does for Pittsburgh. So that's my number 5 receiver. It's 2 different guys basically doing the same thing. There, one in the Atlantic and one in the Coastal Division. Number 4 for me is another Pittsburgh receiver, Jester Weah. 870 yards receiving last year, 10 touchdowns on 36 catches. And for those of you who are not math majors, that's 24.2 yards per catch. One of the top receivers in the ACC last year in that metric. Weah he's an interesting story because freshman and sophomore year there at Pittsburgh, he did not record a single catch. Last year comes out of nowhere, big 6'3" receiver. Was used very effectively in the red zone on deep passing plays. So you have Henderson, running across the field on jet sweeps and catching short passes. Then you have Weah as the deep threat, really making that Pittsburgh offense extremely effective last year. So Weah is my number 4 receiver. Number 3 on my list is Deon Cain. A lot of Pittsburgh fans are going to be mad that I didn't put Weah ahead of Deon Cain, but when considering the fact that Deon Cain also had Mike Williams and Artavis Scott playing receiver in that offense last year, and he was still able to compile 724 yards receiving and 9 touchdowns while averaging 19.1 yards per catch, it's hard to dispute that he's one of the best receivers in the ACC, and I'm putting him ahead of Jester Weah at Pittsburgh because Weah was, really outside of Henderson, a featured guy, while Cain was also competing with Williams and Artavis Scott and still put up insane numbers in a very good passing offense there. With Deshaun Watson, a quarterback last season for Clemson. And, Cain's going to have a much bigger role this year, and whether or not he'll be as good and put up the stats that he has in the past will really depend on how good the quarterback is, whether it's Kelly Bryant or Hunter Johnson, the 2 players who are anticipated to be most in the mix at this point in time for Clemson. It'll be really interesting to see if Cain can keep up the production and still become one of the top receivers in the ACC. Despite turnover at the quarterback position. Number 2 on my list is Amon Richards from Miami, and Richards was one of the best receivers in the country last year as a true freshman, 934 yards receiving, 3 touchdowns. Because he only had 3 touchdowns, he's second on my list. A lot of people will consider Richards to be the top wide receiver in the ACC, and he will be, regardless, one of the best receivers in the conference this year just because he's got the talent level. He's got the size, the speed, the route running ability. It's hard to dispute that Richards is not one of the best receivers in the conference, but in my mind, with an offense that's going to have a new quarterback, an offensive line that's a little bit shaky, it'll be interesting to see if Richards can be a guy who has the same sort of impact on the field this year. Number 1 on my list, just slightly ahead of Amon Richards, is Cam Phillips from Virginia Tech. And Phillips, who was kind of taking a back seat, so to speak. I mean, his stats don't necessarily suggest that because he had his best receiving year of his career last season for the Hokies. But when considering Isaiah Ford and Bucky Hodges played in that same offense, it's really interesting to note that he had 983 yards receiving, 5 touchdowns, both career highs, 12.9 yards per reception, also a career high, and he had 140 yards rushing last year as well. So he's used in passing situations and rushing situations for the Hokies, does a little bit of everything. Obviously a product of a much better offense under Justin Fuente and Brad Cornelson at Virginia Tech, but he's slightly ahead of Richards on my list, more yards, more touchdowns. But, I think Richards is every bit the receiver that Cam Phillips is. So those guys are really interchangeable at 1 and 2. But, a lot of returners here on this list at the receiver position. There are going to be a lot of young guys who are going to be able to make a name for themselves in the respective offenses as well, because we've had so much turnover at the receiver position throughout the conference. So it'll be really interesting to see how this ends up stacking up at the end of the year.
Amon Richards, if you look at his stat line, had a big game against App State in week 2, 4 catches for $142. Then he was pretty quiet for much of the season until he kicked it in November against the likes of Pitt, Virginia, and North Carolina State for 144, 100, and 117 receiving. Tremendous talent. Could really benefit from Brad Kaya, or could have had Kaya stayed for another season. We'll see if his numbers suffer because of the quarterback change and a possible running threat at quarterback for Miami if either Rozier or Perry win the job there with Miami. Cam Phillips, big game against Georgia Tech with 10 receptions, came back against Clemson in the ACC title game with 12 catches and was one of the big factors for Virginia Tech in the big comeback against Arkansas in the Belk Bowl with 6 catches for 115 yards. Yeah, Mike, it's amazing to watch the highlights and look at the stat line for Jester Weah, one of the more amazing stat lines in the country when you consider, as you mentioned, the yards per catch, 870 on 36 receptions. So basically he would step out for most games, catches 2 passes for close to 100 yards, and that was the deal for him, and most of the time got into the end zone once with 10 receptions. So Pitt with a big matchup against Oklahoma State again this year. Weah against the Cowboys last year, 10 catches for 85 yards and a touchdown. Big day against the Canes, 3 catches for $115. Against Duke, typical day, 2 catches for 95 yards. And also against Northwestern with a couple catches for 75 yards in the bowl game against the Wildcats. You mentioned Deion Kane. I'm going to mention Ray McCloud, who arrived at Clemson as the 7th rated athlete category, according to 247 Sports, and he caught 78 passes the last 2 years for 3 touchdowns, 49 receptions for Ray McCloud out of Tampa. I know a lot of Clemson fans are excited to see him get a little bit more playing time this year. And of course, he may not be one of the 5 best receivers in the ACC, but Hunter Renfrow might be one of the 5 most clutch receivers in college football. He's the guy who caught the game winner against Alabama in the championship game, and even 2 years in a losing effort against the Tide, caught 2 touchdown passes against that vaunted Alabama secondary. You mentioned Jalen Samuels. Jalen Smith is also a guy at Louisville to keep an eye out on, with Jamari Staples moving on and James Quick. Louisville and Lamar Jackson would really like Jalen Smith to step in as a number 1 threat. He averaged 22 yards per reception, but just 27 catches for just a tick under 600 yards and 6 touchdowns for Jalen Smith in 2016. Interesting look at wide receiver play in the ACC. We'll start to find out in 3 weeks who is going to step up for the likes of Ryan Switzer and Travis Rudolph, Artavis Scott and Mike Williams here in 2016, and keep up the pace of play that we have seen in recent years in the ACC. Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC and also Fighting Gobbler helping us break down the wide receiver position in the conference. We appreciate it, Mike.
All right. Thanks, Mark.